Hello, and welcome to the ITI Insights briefing, What's Next for the EU AI Act and its impact on global policymaking. As a first mover and leader in AI governments, EU policymakers have the crucial responsibility to ensure the AI Act becomes a future-proof and innovation-enabling tool that increases trust in AI as the legislation heads to trilogue negotiations. Today, ITI's experts Courtney and Marco Barone will discuss what's next for the EU AI Act and provide analysis on the Act's influence on AI regulation globally. Courtney is ITI's Vice President of Policy for Data, Trust, and Technology, where she leads ITI's global AI policy advocacy efforts with a particular focus on fostering the trustworthy and responsible use of AI. Courtney also manages ITI's global cybersecurity policy portfolio. Marco is ITI's Senior Manager of Policy for Europe. He is part of ITI's Brussels team and coordinates ITI's policies and advocacy on AI and data governance issues in Europe. In his role, Marco engages with EU institutions such as the European Commission, Parliament, and member states to represent the tech industry's views on a number of legislative proceedings, including the EU AI Act. Globally, ITI has led the conversation surrounding AI governance. In May, ITI launched the AI Futures Initiative, which aims to craft action-oriented recommendations for the development of AI policy and seeks to address emerging questions around AI globally. ITI also released our AI Transparency Policy Principles in 2022, which builds upon our global AI policy recommendations issued in 2021. Those links will be available in the chat. We thank you for joining us for this timely and important conversation and look forward to your questions. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This conversation is on the record and will be recorded, and please submit your questions through the Q&A function throughout the briefing. I'll now hand it over to Courtney to start the conversation.
Thanks, Jenny. Waiting for Marco. Hey, Marco, how's it going? Good afternoon. So yeah, there's a lot going on in the EU right now. I know we recently saw the Parliament adopt their version of the text. So maybe you could just give us a little bit more about the recent developments in the EU and kind of what the next steps are with regard to the process there.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Courtney, and hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Indeed, we have seen a great deal of interest from policymakers and stakeholders from all over the globe for what's happening in Europe right now on AI governance. And last week was a major milestone in the legislative process that has been going on now for 2 years. So I know that the European Union legislative process is not the most straightforward and easy one to understand for, especially for for people who are not based in Brussels. So I'm happy to give more clarity as to what's going on now and what we're expecting for the next months. Indeed, the vote in the Parliament is a hugely significant milestone. It means that the European Parliament has finalized its position on the AI Act. That does not mean that the regulation is finalized. As I said, we had the Commission proposal in 2021. Member states and the Parliament worked in parallel on their texts, and member states had agreed their position already in December 2022. So now that the Parliament is ready with its own position, the next step of the legislative process will be the so-called trilogue negotiations, which are trilateral negotiations between the member states, so the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission. So the first meeting already took place right after the vote last week on the 14th of June, and we expect these negotiations to continue for the coming months under the upcoming Spanish presidency of the Council of the EU. So, you know, the Spanish have already said that they plan to be very ambitious on this file. So there is a possibility that the work will be finalized ahead of the end of their term in December 2023. But that's, of course, not set in stone. And there's also a possibility that the work will continue in 2024.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a helpful overview, especially for folks that are not super closely following all the intricacies of EU policymaking. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about you know, kind of some of the differences that you're seeing between the Council and the Parliament text and, you know, kind of how things would unfold moving forward, or kind of how things might be implemented, or maybe what you see as potential kind of areas of divergence between the two texts.
Yeah, indeed. The two co-legislators, so the two institutions, they have taken I mean, they followed a similar path on many of the key points of the AI Act, following similar principles, but then the practical solutions that were presented in the two texts differ on some points. Not necessarily on all of them. Definitely the basics of the AA Act, and that is the risk-based approach is maintained in both texts. So that means that the regulation is not meant to regulate AI itself as a technology, but rather the use that is made of AI in certain specific use cases. So that's defined through levels of risk. We have unacceptable uses of risk, uses of AI that would be banned from being put in the market in Europe. And those include live biometric recognition used by the police, social scoring, or manipulative uses of AI. We have high-risk AI uses, which are those that would pose risks to safety and fundamental rights, and those would be subject to comprehensive regulatory requirements and also would be needed to be tested for conformity. And then there's also some requirements on AI that poses limited risk, and those are mainly transparency requirements for deepfakes or other types of generative AI. Indeed, both the institutions also added new elements to the regulation that were not there before. So that especially pertains to regulation of foundation models or general purpose AI systems. So that would be models or systems that can perform different functions, so that do not really fit into the use case oriented logic of the original Commission's proposal. And the two institutions have proposed different solutions on that. So we will see how the discussion plays out in the trilogues, but definitely if I have to choose some key differences where the two institutions have found different solutions, I would say the process of designation of what is to be considered a high-risk AI use case is different. The rules that would apply to foundation models or general purpose AI are different. There are noticeable differences on what is to be considered unacceptable AI, and so how the extent to which certain AI uses should be banned, and then different approaches to the governance and the enforcement of the regulation.
Thanks, Marco. And so, with that overview in mind, are there particular areas where you think, this is kind of moving in the right direction, or, maybe this could be improved moving forward? In from your perspective, how are you seeing some of the changes in both of those texts, and maybe what are things that ITI could be, in support of versus things that maybe, we're still hoping to see some improvement on?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, we as ITI and the broader tech industry, but also the wider AI governance ecosystem has engaged in this process for years now. I mean, it's a process that started back in 2018 already with the high-level expert group. So it's been a long conversation, and definitely the stage of the debate in Europe is very mature at this point. I think, some of the basics of the AI Act that have been the cornerstone of this approach since the beginning are something that's we as ITI have strongly supported. So, for example, the risk-based approach that I mentioned before, that's hugely important to make sure that the legislative framework strikes the right balance between what is needed to, protect against certain risks that may arise from AI uses, and target the regulatory framework to where an intervention is needed, while at the same time, avoid overburdening the sector, especially where the regulatory requirements are not needed for consideration of, safety to fundamental rights and safety. So definitely the fact that both institutions have maintained as an underlying approach the risk-based approach, that is something that we welcome a lot. It is crucially important that institutions have recognized that regulation is not needed for the technology itself or for all uses of the technology, but only those that really pose certain risks and therefore require certain mitigations to be taken across the value chain. Other important aspects that we have supported both in the council proposal and also in the parliament proposal is the work around the definition of AI. That's clearly the first question that comes to mind when you talk about AI regulation is what is AI? And we strongly appreciated the fact that, for example, the parliament took as a model the OECD definition. That's it's very important to have a global reference when it comes to the basic terms, the basic lexicon used for AI governance, because that helps, of course, making sure that different countries speak about the same thing. And that's the process of AI governance, which is by nature global, since the technology itself is developed globally, can proceed in a way that all the parts understand each other, and there is a degree of interoperability in the way at least different jurisdictions talk about the same problem. So it's crucially important, and it's also clearly also trade facilitative to have mutual understanding of what AI is. So the fact that the OECD definition has been used as an inspiration or as a basis for the AI Act definition, that's crucially important. But moving to the second part of your question, when you say what's next, I think there's a lot to do next. Clearly, it's still a process that is in motion, and the fact that the trilogue negotiation will have to bridge between the two positions that still have a degree of distance, it means that the debate is still open and there are questions that need to be answered. I think from our side, the first major question is, how do you operationalize the risk-based approach? Meaning, how do you take that principle that only risky AI uses should be governed by regulation and transform it into an actionable definition that gives legal certainty to companies that need to proceed to market, and that they can do so in a way that is safe and compliant with the regulation. So how to get the definitions and the details right, and this process of operationalization of the risk-based approach, that's going to be crucially important in the trilogue negotiations, and I think it's still an open discussion. As I said, both the Council and the Parliament have taken a slightly different approach in the process of identification of what's a high-risk AI use. I do think there is some distance to be bridged there. The second point I would say is foundation models. So that's an element that really appeared later on in the discussion, and definitely it was also supported by the mediatic attention around the explosion of certain new applications of AI. I think the conversation should still consider how to make sure that you can have holistic risk management that involves all the actors in the supply chain to make sure that certain risks that may arise from the use of a foundation model or from the implementation of a foundation model into a high-risk AI use. I think that those details are still to be discussed. One point that needs to be clear, though, is that definitely it's impossible to apply those risk management requirements of the AI Act that were thought with an intended purpose in mind. So with a concrete use case to a context of foundation models, which are by definition can be applied to a variety of tasks, some of which may not even be foreseeable during the development stage. So it's really difficult to take the right approach there and think about what measures would make sense. I do think that being too prescriptive would be a risk there. But at the same time, I do think that there is value in thinking about how do we ensure that the different stakeholders in the value chain can communicate with each other to perform this exercise of holistic risk management across the value chain and enable compliance with regulatory requirements where needed for the circumstances of risk. I think maybe the final point that I would like to make in terms of what we see as priorities for the trilogues, it's clear that the conversation on AI governance, at least at this broader level, is nascent. There are still a lot. There's a lot of efforts that are being done by the global tech industry to come up with technical solutions, for example, standardization bodies that can address some of the key questions that regulators are asking around the world. So it's crucially important that the AI Act also keeps the pace with these developments that are happening globally, and continues to rely on global standards that are developed by all actors across the world. I think that's important to make sure that the regulation can be future-proof and that the best technical solution can be used to demonstrate compliance with the critically important requirements of the EU AI Act.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Marco. I think there's, of course, still quite a few things to be worked out as the trilogues move forward. And I think particularly around some of these key questions about actual operationalization of a risk-based framework, and how you address some of these concerns around foundation models with the explosion of ChatGPT, and certainly I think more broadly than that, thinking through, how do you really future-proof legislation in a way that every time there is an evolution of technology, you still have something that is flexible enough to address, potential risks, while also not having to go back and update legislation every time something like ChatGPT comes out and is widely available, or LLMs kind of explode onto the scene. And so I think it's kind of interesting to see Europe as moving forward in this space and kind of seeing how they're thinking through some of these things, because I do think, there is a lot of attention being paid to how some of these things are going to be approached. And certainly, I think in a lot of jurisdictions, Europe is seen as kind of a first mover. And so I'm curious about your perspective on that and how that has, influenced the policymaking work that's happening in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly there is a sense of responsibility of the broader tech policy community here in Brussels that, this is the first horizontal framework for AI regulation, and there is a perception that this can serve as a blueprint, or elements of it can serve as a blueprint for the globe. Of course, jurisdictions across the world are thinking about AI governance in different ways. Some are more, some are closer to the EU in thinking that regulatory framework is the right approach. Some are considering other type of sectoral or different types of instruments. But the substantial conversations that we're having on the details of what can be done really to make sure that we can all use the technology, we can enable the market and the people to use the technology in a way that is safe, in a way that is trustworthy, and in a way that's allows to reap the benefit of what is arguably the most important technological transition that we're living through at the moment. So I do see that that sense of responsibility is there in policymakers, and at the same time paired with a level of maturity and detail of the debate that's probably unseen in other jurisdictions. Of course, that also creates challenges, because when you're the first one having one type of like a specific conversation, then it means that you have to think about the vocabulary first, and in some cases having the AI Act already out there, it means that you have to adjust what is a very fast-pacing technological change to the legislative framework that you have. So I think the example of generative AI is a very relevant one, because clearly you need to think of your regulatory framework as an instrument that can remain relevant as technology changes and evolves. And so therefore, I think it's important that we reflect on how to future-proof the AI Act. And the point that I made before about reliance on global standards, about taking into account the state of the art, and also avoiding being too prescriptive, it's absolutely important. So indeed, I think the conversation here is very advanced. At the same time, there is there is a global attention to AI governance. We've seen it more and more in the past months, and as you said, the explosion of ChatGPT made it a very mediatic topic. So I'm actually curious, and I will use this occasion to change the roles and ask you questions.
Great.
How you've seen in your role as the global lead on our AI work with ITI, how you've seen other jurisdictions watching what's happening here in Europe, and whether you've seen elements of what the European Union is doing being already exported or adopted or adapted to the solutions that different regulators are looking at.
Yeah, that's a great question, Marco. And I think the short answer to your question is yes. I would say everywhere that I have, been engaged with around the world, be that in Latin America, in the Asia Pacific, in the UK, et cetera, everyone is paying attention to what the European Union is doing. And certainly, like you mentioned, I think we are seeing kind of different flavors of approaches being taken with regard to AI governance. I think, different countries are in different places. in the course of conversation. I would say many countries are kind of just starting to think through what should this look like, and do we need to have something in place? Do the laws that we have already cover some of these risks and issues that we're seeing emerge? I do think that the EU AI Act has been a point of reference, though, for many policymakers. And so one of the things about being a first mover is that you are, as you noted, kind of figuring things out without a playbook. You're defining things for the first time. But once it's out there, it does serve as, I think, a guide in some ways for other jurisdictions. And so there is kind of this level of inspiration that I am seeing emerge in, different text, be that the recent Brazil AI Bill of Law that was introduced. Again, I think a lot of these approaches seek to also be risk-based in that they are, kind of designating specific uses of AI as high risk, which of course has been a cornerstone of our advocacy internationally, which is a positive. So I think we're seeing a lot of that replicated. I think, another thing that we're seeing is this emergence of conversation around what actually constitutes high risk. There's a definition of high risk in the EU AI Act. I think that's been one that we've, generally embraced, but certainly in other jurisdictions, there are conversations about kind of what high risk looks like and how you characterize that, and then how that is actually, kind of then incorporated into legislation. And so I think one of the things that's going to be important moving forward is trying to align around, some kind of definition of high risk, recognizing, of course, that each jurisdiction might have, slightly different values and commitments that they need to respect in the context of their kind of cultural and societal differences, so not every society necessarily is exactly the same, but certainly I think there is perhaps a way in which a general understanding can be facilitated around that. Other places that we're seeing kind of legislation are in Chile and Colombia. Latin America has definitely been very interested in moving forward with governance approaches. Chile is proposing to set up a commission to kind of evaluate how to regulate AI, so kind of taking a first step to do so. But there are also some kind of provisions within that bill that would require developers to receive an authorization from the commission. So there are some kind of interesting new ideas in there. Canada is also kind of seeking to take a risk-based approach, but again, there's no definition of what a high impact system is. So that is some cause for legal uncertainty, I would say, moving forward. But again, a lot of these bills are still in the discussion phases. So we haven't seen anyone quite as far along in their debate as Europe. And certainly places like Singapore and Japan, I think, are still focused more on kind of a self-regulatory, softer law approach, where they have, kind of this governance framework out there for voluntary use, and organizations can really take that and work with it to see how it best fits into their risk management efforts.
That is extremely interesting. Thank you, Courtney, for painting that picture. I think, maybe many of the European listeners or even the US-based listeners do not realize that indeed the conversation is expanding across the globe, and many jurisdictions are really asking probably the same questions. Definitely, I mean, I agree with you that the level of maturity of the EU debate, it does help with elevating the EU AI Act as somehow a blueprint. Of course, recognizing that, as you rightly pointed out, there are different circumstances, there are also different understanding of what is risk when it comes to AI, and there are different sensitivities that jurisdictions may take into account. Before passing to the next question, I see that there is a question from the audience asking about the timeline for the EU AI Act. They're asking whether there's a risk that the AI Act will not be enacted by the end of this commission's term. So in terms of enacting the AI Act, I mean, there is a 2-year transition period after the law is officially published in the official journal. So we won't have it in place for at least a few years from now, probably starting 2026, best case scenario. In terms of the conclusion of the legislative process, I mean, the new commission will start working next year after the European elections are taking place in June 2024. So it usually takes a while because before the new commission is operational. I think from the community and from the point of view here in Brussels is that there is enough political will to have this done as soon as possible. So I think the chances of the AA Act not being approved by the second half of next year are probably slim, but it really depends on how the negotiations will go. As I said, there are some sensitive points, some points where there are differences between the institutions. So it really depends on how easy it will be to find an agreement. Probably, if I have to do my anticipation of what will be the most controversial point, is definitely the question of the bans and to what extent can law enforcement agencies use AI for live biometric surveillance. There are different perspectives in different institutions, and that has proven to be one of the most politically charged points of the AA Act. So I hope that answers the question. But going back to the discussion we were having on global approaches, clearly, we haven't mentioned the United States, so the jurisdictions where you're based. I'm curious to hear also how the debate has unfolded in the US, especially given the progress that the EU, being one of the, if not the main commercial partner of the US, and definitely a like-minded partner. So what has been the reaction to the EU AA Act in the US, and do you see any willingness in the US to pick one model of AI governance over another?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I purposely did not talk about the US in my prior comments because there's a lot going on here now. Certainly, AI has been on policymakers' radar in the US for, a number of years, but I will say, with, I think, some of these tools becoming publicly accessible, it has really ramped up the attention on AI, particularly large language models. But I think at this point, both with kind of the explosion of not only kind of media attention on large language models and these tools, but also with the EU AI Act kind of at the stage that it's at, it is impacting, I think, the conversation here in the US. And so policymakers at this point are obviously thinking about what the appropriate way to approach AI governance and AI regulation is. We're seeing, folks like Senator Schumer proposing kind of frameworks for regulation. In a couple of hours, he's going to be holding a press briefing where he is unveiling his kind of vision for AI regulation here in the United States. We're seeing folks in the House like Representative Liu proposing text that would, establish a commission to investigate the best ways to regulate AI. So I think where we're at right now is that there is a growing consensus that, something needs to happen. I think it's still not quite clear exactly how it will unfold. I would be remiss not to mention all of the administration activity as well. Certainly over the last several years, we have seen NIST create its AI risk management framework. We have seen OSTP come out with a blueprint, and now several additional administration announcements have been made about kind of the steps that the administration is taking to mitigate risks of AI, while also allowing for folks to receive the benefits that come along with AI as well. And so I think, there are still a lot of mechanics that need to be worked through in terms of what the right approach is. There could potentially be a proposal for more comprehensive legislation, but I think there could also be a series of proposals that are, focused more specifically on uses. I mean, one of the things that we've been very much encouraging policymakers to do is really review kind of what the existing legal landscape looks like here in the US, because there are specific risks associated with AI that are not kind of unique. So other laws may already cover some of those concerns, but certainly there may be other areas where there are unique risks that laws either need to be adapted or otherwise updated to address. And then if there is clearly a gap somewhere at that point, it might make sense then to proceed with, the creation of new legislation. But I think, at this point, I haven't seen a consensus about kind of what the ultimate direction will be, just that there is the understanding that at this point there is a need for something on the books.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting that so many stakeholders are looking at the same questions and are proposing different ways of addressing similar problems. I think that element of cooperation that we talked about before is crucial to really have a meaningful discussion of what it means to do AI governance, what it means to mitigate risks. Clearly, the technology is global, so it's a conversation that requires, if not interoperability, at least a dialogue between like-minded countries to have a similar understanding of what they're talking about. And I think the example of the transatlantic relation is immensely relevant, again, for the significance of the relationship, of the economic relationship, but also for the importance of the two jurisdictions in the global stage. And we did see that governments in the EU and the US are being responsive to that expectation of dialogue on AI governance. There is a lot of work that has been done at the level of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. We also heard this announcement for an AI code of conduct that was in the press after the last meeting of the Trade and Technology Council. We hear that that can be also tied with ongoing work that is being done at the level of the G7. Maybe I would be curious to hear more what you think about this element of global cooperation and what we can expect in terms of what these dynamics can deliver.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and certainly, as you mentioned, I think given the fact that so many nations are now thinking about how they need to approach some of these key questions, coordination and the importance of collaboration across borders cannot be understated. I mean, it's very, very important because I do think the element of interoperability is, going to be crucial in that when companies are building products and placing them on the market, right? It would be ideal to not have to build your product to 20 or more different kind of regulations. So to the extent that conversation can happen in a way that allows for, if not complete harmonization, at least alignment or a common understanding of certain themes, that will be important. Obviously, you mentioned the EU-US TTC. I think that has been an important vehicle for conversation and collaboration on AI in particular. I would venture to say, that's one of the areas where we have seen kind of the most work happen, at least, publicly. There's a roadmap that's out there that they are working together to implement. I think there are some really important things that are contained within that roadmap around kind of creating not only a common understanding of risk, but kind of what different risks look like. I think, beyond that, kind of the common terminology and language that they're working to agree upon is a helpful first step, because I think, as you referenced at the outset, having everybody on the same page on what it means when you're saying AI system, what it means when you're saying foundation model, which stakeholders are in the AI value chain and ecosystem that you need to be aware of when you're thinking through regulation, all of those things are going to be increasingly important. I think the EU and the US obviously have, a significant opportunity to influence the conversation in other places. And so I think, continuing to take this kind of process on the AI code of conduct together with other nations, or pairing it kind of with the G7 Hiroshima process that we heard about being launched a couple of weeks ago, will be increasingly important to also kind of expand the conversation to other, like-minded nations that are similarly working to address some of these issues. I think it's important because you're also then open to new ideas, things you may not have thought of before. So really having that collaboration and cooperative approach is key to, I think, having just a really robust discussion on some of these issue areas.
I agree. I think there is potential, especially in view of, involving the broader community in this conversation and making sure that there can be a common reflection of on these important governance issues in a global framework. Through cooperation between like-minded countries. I do see that there are some questions in the Q&A that we may want to address. So there's one on the rules on foundation models. The question is asking whether about the specific requirements on foundation models that the Parliament has inserted in their position. I do think that I do agree that the question, the point on bias is something that we should reflect on, because one of the points that we've been making is that in crafting requirements that can be meaningful for managing risks that may come out uses of foundation models. You have to think of what can be done at the development stage, right? The question of bias, which is something that is very context specific, can be difficult to anticipate at the development stage. So I do agree that there are some issues that should be taken into account to strike the right balance when it comes to what you're asking the developers of a foundation model to take into account. And that's also why we as the tech industry, we have supported this idea of enabling transparency across the value chain to make sure that all the actors who are in the right place to perform certain risk assessments. So for example, in the case of bias, I agree with you that it's better to look at closer to the context of deployment, that in those cases, those actors can have the right information at hand to comply with the requirements of the AI Act. And you also there was also a question on copyright. Indeed, there is one requirement that addresses copyright. It's not it doesn't speak about opting out from copyrights from material that is covered by copyrights, but it's more about disclosure. So they're basically what the Parliament added in their position is to for the developers of these foundation models to provide a summary of what kind of data covered by copyrights rules was used for the training of the model, which clearly this is going to be a discussion in the trilogues, being only a milestone in a longer process. We're not sure if that's going to be eventually there. We have also raised question as to whether it's feasible in the context of foundation models that in many cases are trained with huge amounts of data. In many cases, they're taken from the whole internet, and therefore providing a summary of what's covered by IP rules can be challenging. And this goes back to what we said before about the need for the requirements to be practical, feasible, based on the state of the art, and following the pace also of the technological developments that are taking place as the community thinks about how to mitigate potential risks that can happen across the different stages of the value chain.
Great. Thanks, Marco. Sorry, I'm seeing other questions coming in, so just trying to figure out if we have enough time to kind of go through some of these. I don't know that we necessarily have a lot of time. There's one question about looking at the TTC and the collaboration between the US and the EU vis-a-vis competitiveness with China. I think at a high level, right, we're obviously competitiveness is an important consideration. I think that is very clear in both the US and the EU context. We also recognize that there are other countries who are also, developing AI technology. And so certainly to the extent that we are able to leverage the TTC to agree upon outcomes that are helpful to fostering competitiveness and kind of continuing to help promote leadership of the EU and the US in, the development and deployment of AI technology, that will be incredibly important to kind of maintaining that competitiveness across the board. And certainly I think we saw this in prior iterations of technology, but there is, I think a need to kind of continue to evolve positioning in order to make sure that, the steps that are being taken as a result of the TTC are appropriately supporting kind of that underlying theme of innovation and competitiveness. Marco, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, but that would be my take.
I agree. I mean, I think it's great that the forum is there to make sure that, there's a table to sit for the two jurisdictions to, compare notes and think about how to solve this problem together. So it's crucially important that this work continues and that it's put in a position that it can deliver something tangible.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that we are at our time. Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciated the opportunity to share some perspectives on the EU AI Act and its global influence and potential next steps for the EU as well as other jurisdictions. We appreciate you all being here today, and we drop some links in the chat. So hopefully you all will check that out. All right. Thanks very much.